Lone Cowboy performed CPR on the Apache woman he saved from drowning, unaware of the consequences. The sun hung low in the Arizona sky, casting long shadows across the rugged desert landscape. Dust swirled in the dry air, and the distant mountains glowed orange as the evening approached. Jake Carter, a lone cowboy, guided his horse steadily along a narrow trail that followed the river. He was a man of few words, known to most as a wanderer who preferred the quiet company of the land and his horse over the chaos of towns. His face was weathered from years under the scorching sun, and his hands were rough from handling ropes, saddles, and the endless work of a cowboy's life. Though he lived alone, he was respected for his courage, resourcefulness, and unwavering calm in dangerous situations. Jake had been traveling for days, moving from one grazing area to another, searching for water and shelter for both himself and his horse. The desert was unforgiving, and he had learned to read the land carefully, watching the sky for sudden storms, tracking the flow of the river, and noting the movement of animals. His life was simple, but it demanded constant attention, skill, and patience. He was used to solitude and had grown comfortable with it, thinking that no one could truly understand the quiet rhythm of the desert like he did. That afternoon, as he approached a bend in the river, something unusual caught his eye. There was a sudden splash, a thrashing movement in the water, followed by a frantic struggle. Without a moment's hesitation, Jake urged his horse closer to the riverbank, narrowing his eyes to see more clearly. A young woman was caught in the current, her body dragged downstream by the powerful flow. She was flailing, trying to grab hold of anything within reach, but the river's strength was overwhelming. Panic flashed in her eyes, and her cries were barely audible over the roar of the water. Instinct took over. Jake knew he couldn't wait for anyone else. No help was coming in this remote part of the desert. He kicked off his boots, rolled up his trousers, and waded into the water. The cold hit him immediately, but he focused on the task at hand. Step by step, he pushed against the current, his arms straining as he reached out toward the young woman. Her hair was dark and tangled with mud, and her skin shone wet under the fading sunlight. She was clearly exhausted, her movements weakening with every passing second. Finally, Jake reached her, grabbing her just as the river threatened to pull her under completely. He held her tight, struggling against the current, and carefully maneuvered toward the shallower waters. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the urgency of saving a life. With every step, he felt the water trying to pull him back, but he didn't release her. They finally reached the bank, gasping and coughing as they collapsed onto the wet sand. The river continued to roar beside them, but for a moment, all that mattered was that she was alive. She lay on the ground, her chest rising and falling in irregular gasps. Jake could see that she had swallowed some water and was struggling to breathe. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, checking her pulse and assessing her condition. Years of living in the wilderness had taught him basic first aid, and he knew that time was critical. He positioned her carefully, tilted her head back, and began performing CPR. He pressed firmly on her chest, following the rhythm he had learned long ago, alternating with rescue breaths. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The woman's skin was pale and Jake's hands were raw from the effort, but he refused to give up. Finally, she coughed violently, spitting water onto the sand. Her eyes fluttered open and she gasped for air, trembling and weak. Relief washed over Jake, though he remained focused, gently comforting her as she regained strength. She clutched at his arm, her hands shaking, but there was gratitude in her eyes, a silent thank you that needed no words. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice calm, though a part of him was still shaken. The woman tried to speak but could only manage a hoarse whisper. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Though they did not understand each other's language fully, the look of relief and gratitude transcended words. Jake reached for his jacket, carefully wrapping it around her shoulders to keep her warm. The sun had dipped lower, and a cool breeze swept across the desert, bringing a sharp chill after the heat of the day. As she slowly sat up, she pointed toward the nearby path, gesturing for him to follow. Jake realized she was trying to show him where she had been before the accident, perhaps where she lived or where she had been heading. He helped her to her feet, steadying her as she regained her balance. Despite her exhaustion, she moved with a quiet determination, as if she was aware that they needed to get somewhere safe before nightfall. The two of them made their way along the riverbank, Jake supporting her and keeping a careful eye on the terrain. Every step was cautious, mindful of the slippery rocks and hidden currents. They eventually reached a small clearing where the woman paused, kneeling to catch her breath. She looked around at the surroundings, a mixture of concern and awe in her expression. It was clear that she had been traveling alone and had never expected to encounter anyone, especially a stranger willing to risk his life for hers. Jake, too, felt a sense of awe, not just at the strength and resilience of the woman, but at the unpredictability of life itself. He had lived many years in the wilderness, facing dangers from animals, weather, and isolation, but he had never experienced a moment quite like this, saving a life from the grip of the river, forging an unspoken bond with a stranger who was completely different from him. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the desert was bathed in a deep orange and purple glow. The river reflected the colors, and the sounds of nature, crickets, distant birds, the flowing water, filled the air. Jake finally allowed himself to relax, sitting beside the woman, who was wrapped in his jacket and shivering slightly. He offered her water from his canteen, and she drank carefully, savoring the liquid like it was the most precious thing in the world. In those quiet moments, a connection began to form. Jake learned her name, Nayeli, through gestures and broken words. She nodded when he spoke his own name, and for the first time in many years, Jake felt a sense of companionship, however fleeting it might be. There was no need for grand gestures or speeches. The shared experience of survival and rescue had created a bond stronger than words. As darkness fell completely, Jake set up a small fire with the dry wood nearby. The warmth and light provided comfort against the encroaching chill. Nayeli watched the flames with a mixture of curiosity and caution, clearly aware of the power of fire, but also intrigued by its safety and warmth. Jake sat close, keeping a careful watch on both her and the surroundings. He understood the desert well enough to know that night brought new dangers, wild animals, cold temperatures, and the uncertainty of unfamiliar territory. Throughout the night, Jake kept a gentle, protective watch. Nayeli eventually rested, her breathing slowly returning to normal, while Jake remained alert, pondering the day's extraordinary events. He realized that this encounter had changed something within him. He had always valued solitude and independence, but now he felt the stirrings of empathy, connection, and responsibility toward another human being. Saving a life had brought not only relief, but a new awareness of how fragile and precious life could be. By the time dawn approached, the desert had transformed once again. The first light painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, and the river sparkled with renewed energy. Jake and Nayeli prepared to continue their journey, both aware that the day ahead would bring new challenges. The cowboy had saved a life, but neither of them knew how this event would shape their futures. The encounter was only the beginning, and the ripples of that single moment would soon extend far beyond the riverbank where it all began. In that quiet desert morning, Jake felt a mixture of relief, pride, and a hint of unease. He had done what any decent person would do. He had saved a life. But life was never simple, and he sensed that the consequences of this act, both expected and unforeseen, were only just beginning to unfold. Nayeli, now recovering, looked at him with cautious trust, a silent acknowledgement of the bond formed in the struggle against the river. And so, under the vast desert sky, two lives had intersected, forever changed by courage, instinct, and the unpredictability of fate. After the exhausting night beside the river, Jake Carter and Nayeli slowly resumed their journey. The morning sun had warmed the desert just enough to make travel bearable, and the quiet sounds of birds and rustling leaves accompanied them. Nayeli was still weak from her struggle in the river, but she moved with careful determination, balancing herself on the uneven desert terrain. Jake supported her when necessary, offering a steady arm and gentle words. Though they could not fully understand each other's language, their actions and gestures communicated more than words ever could. As they walked, Jake observed Nayeli closely. Her eyes, dark and alert, scanned their surroundings constantly, reflecting a life spent being cautious and aware of danger. There was a quiet strength in her movements, a resilience that belied her young age. Jake admired this greatly. He had seen many people in his travels, but few possessed such a combination of courage and humility. For her part, Nayeli studied Jake with curiosity. She had never met someone like him before, a lone man who lived with the land, guided by instinct, knowledge, and quiet confidence. Eventually, they reached a small clearing where the sun filtered through a cluster of trees, offering shade and a moment of respite. Nayeli paused to rest, sitting on a smooth rock and rubbing her sore arms. Jake poured water from his canteen into his hand and handed it to her. She drank carefully, savoring each sip, and then passed it back with a quiet nod of thanks. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a bridge forming between two very different worlds. Jake realized that he needed to ensure Nayeli was strong enough to continue traveling safely. He asked her, as best he could, if she had a family or a village nearby. She hesitated at first, unsure if she could trust him completely. Then, in broken words and gestures, she indicated that her home was not far, across the hills and through a small forest. It was clear that she did not travel often alone, and the journey to get water had been a risk she had taken out of necessity. Jake respected her independence, but also understood the dangers she had faced. As they moved forward, Jake shared some of his own knowledge of the land. He pointed out safe paths, places where the ground was stable, and areas where water could be found. Nayeli watched attentively, occasionally repeating his gestures and mimicking his careful steps. In the silence between them, a quiet understanding grew. Both were learning from each other, not just about survival but about life, trust, and the unspoken rules of their respective worlds. By midday, they reached a shaded creek. Nayeli knelt by the water to drink and wash some of the mud from her clothes. Jake gave her space, recognizing the importance of dignity and privacy even in such a precarious situation. As she worked, she began to speak in her language more freely, pointing out plants and markings that Jake could not fully understand but could sense were significant to her. He nodded and listened attentively, understanding that these small details were part of her life, her family, and her culture. After the short break, they continued. The terrain became rougher, with steep slopes and thorny bushes. Jake guided Nayeli carefully, occasionally lifting her over obstacles or helping her navigate tricky paths. Despite her fatigue, she remained determined, and Jake could see the stubborn spark of spirit in her eyes, a refusal to be defeated by circumstance. He admired this, realizing that her courage was not just about surviving the river, but about facing life with strength and dignity. As they approached the outskirts of her village, Jake could sense a change in Nayeli's demeanor. She became more alert, scanning the horizon for familiar landmarks. Her pace quickened slightly, though not recklessly, and there was a mixture of relief and apprehension in her movements. Jake stayed close, knowing that the transition from the wilderness to her community could be delicate. People in remote villages often viewed outsiders with suspicion, and he had no desire to frighten or offend anyone. When they finally reached a small cluster of adobe homes, Nayeli hesitated at the edge of the village. She looked back at Jake, her eyes filled with gratitude and concern. He smiled gently, gesturing for her to go on without fear. She nodded and stepped forward, her body tense but determined. Jake followed at a safe distance, respecting the boundary of her community while remaining ready to help if needed. As Nayeli entered the village, elders and family members noticed her arrival. Some ran forward with relief, others with caution. Her younger siblings stared in wide-eyed wonder, recognizing her as safe, but sensing that something unusual had occurred. Nayeli quickly explained, using gestures and fragmented words, that a stranger had saved her life from the river. The story spread rapidly, and curiosity grew among the villagers. They had never encountered Jake before, and his presence stirred both gratitude and concern. Elders approached cautiously, their expressions a mix of suspicion and curiosity. They asked questions in their language, trying to understand who Jake was and why he had been in the wilderness with Nayeli. She explained as best she could, recounting the struggle in the river and how the cowboy had risked his life to save hers. While some nodded with understanding, others frowned, wary of outsiders and the unknown consequences of this encounter. Jake stood a short distance away, careful not to intrude. He observed the interaction silently, recognizing the delicate balance between heroism and respect for cultural boundaries. He knew that his actions, though noble in intent, might be misinterpreted or questioned. Despite this, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing he had saved a life and helped someone in desperate need. Over the next few days, Jake remained near the village, checking on Nayeli's recovery from a respectful distance. He helped when asked, offering guidance on safe paths, water sources, and basic survival tips. Nayeli's family gradually became more comfortable with his presence, seeing his kindness, honesty, and willingness to respect their customs. However, not everyone in the village was immediately trusting. Rumors began to circulate among a few villagers who had never seen an outsider like Jake, and whispers of caution and concern reached Nayeli's ears. During this time, Jake and Nayeli developed a deeper bond. Though words were limited, their understanding grew through shared experiences, gestures, and small acts of kindness. Jake admired Nayeli's resilience, her deep connection to her family, and her unwavering determination to overcome adversity. Nayeli, in turn, appreciated Jake's bravery, patience, and quiet respect for her culture. They began to communicate more effectively, using a mix of gestures, expressions, and simple words that both could understand. Evenings were spent near the river or around small fires, where Jake shared stories of his life in the wilderness. He spoke of long rides across open plains, the challenges of survival, and the lessons he had learned from nature. Nayeli listened intently, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply observing. In return, she shared stories of her people, their traditions, and the lessons passed down from elders. Through these exchanges, Jake gained a deeper appreciation for the richness of her culture, the strength of community, and the wisdom that comes from generations of experience. Despite the growing friendship, Jake remained aware of the underlying tension. He understood that not all villagers were comfortable with his presence, and he knew that missteps could have serious consequences. He approached every interaction with humility and patience, striving to build trust rather than impose himself. Nayeli guided him, helping him understand what was acceptable, what gestures were polite, and how to navigate the subtle boundaries of her community. As days passed, the village began to accept Jake cautiously. Children approached him with curiosity, elders acknowledged his presence with nods, and Nayeli's family allowed him to assist in small ways. The bond between Jake and Nayeli strengthened, rooted in mutual respect and shared experiences. Yet beneath the surface, the villagers' cautiousness reminded Jake that heroism often came with unforeseen consequences. One afternoon, as they walked near the outskirts of the village, Jake noticed Naeli pausing by a grove of trees. She gestured for him to sit, then pointed to the horizon, indicating the surrounding lands and explaining, through gestures, the importance of water sources, hunting areas, and sacred spaces. Jake listened attentively, learning not just about survival, but about the deeper connection between the people and the land they inhabited. It became clear that this knowledge was not merely practical. It was part of their identity, a bond with ancestors and nature alike. In these moments, Jake realized that saving Naeli had opened a door into a world he had never known. It was a world of community, tradition, and interconnectedness, so different from his solitary life in the wilderness, yet deeply fascinating. Naeli, in turn, began to see Jake not just as a rescuer but as a friend, someone who respected her people and shared in the human experience of empathy, courage, and trust. By the end of the week, Naeli had regained her strength, and the village had grown more comfortable with Jake's presence. Their interactions had created a delicate harmony, balancing gratitude, respect, and cultural understanding. Jake understood that this bond was fragile and required continued care, patience, and humility. He had learned that heroism extended beyond the act of saving a life. It involved navigating relationships, earning trust, and respecting boundaries. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky with deep shades of orange and purple, Jake sat beside Naeli and her family. The gentle crackle of the fire, the soft hum of the river, and the quiet laughter of children created a sense of peace and connection. In that moment, Jake reflected on the extraordinary events that had brought him here: the rescue in the river, the journey to the village, and the tentative bonds forming between two worlds. He realized that while the act of saving a life had been immediate and urgent, the consequences, friendships, trust, cultural understanding, would unfold over time. And so, as night fell, the cowboy and the young Apache woman sat together, connected by an experience neither could forget. The desert stretched endlessly around them, vast and unchanging, yet within its expanse, a story of courage, empathy, and unexpected friendship had begun. A story that would continue to grow, shaping their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Life in the village had slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but Jake Carter could sense that something had changed. The once quiet desert settlement now carried whispers about the stranger who had appeared so suddenly and saved Naeli from the river. Some villagers admired his courage, while others eyed him with suspicion, unsure of his intentions. Jake had grown accustomed to solitude and the freedom of wandering alone, but here, in the heart of a tightly knit community, he realized that every action he took was being watched, judged, and interpreted. Naeli, on the other hand, was regaining her strength day by day. She moved gracefully among her family and neighbors, fetching water, tending to small chores, and laughing softly with her younger siblings. Yet even as she carried on with her daily life, she cast frequent glances toward Jake, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and concern. She knew that he had risked his life for her, and she also understood that some villagers were wary of his presence. Their relationship was simple yet profound, a bond built on survival, trust, and shared experience, but it existed within a larger context of caution and cultural boundaries. Jake tried to integrate himself quietly, helping where he could without imposing. He assisted with fetching water, repairing fences, and guiding villagers safely along the uneven desert terrain. His efforts were genuine, yet he could feel the lingering tension in some of the elders' eyes. They were polite but reserved, acknowledging his help but remaining distant. Jake had learned over the years that respect had to be earned, especially in a community where outsiders were rare and trust was guarded. He approached every interaction with patience, humility, and a willingness to learn. Despite the cautious acceptance from some villagers, others began to question his presence. Rumors, subtle but persistent, began circulating. Some whispered that Jake had ulterior motives, that he might be trying to exploit Nayeli or interfere with tribal matters. Jake overheard bits and pieces of these conversations, but he remained calm. He knew that misunderstandings were inevitable when people came from different worlds, and he resolved to let his actions speak louder than words. Nayeli, aware of these murmurs, grew protective. She had experienced the fear of losing control over her life once in the river, and she did not want Jake to be misunderstood or threatened. One afternoon, Jake accompanied Nayeli to a nearby grove where she collected herbs for cooking and medicine. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. As Nayeli gathered leaves and roots, Jake observed quietly, respecting her space and paying attention to the customs she followed. He realized that even small actions held significance in her culture: how plants were picked, the way they were handled, and the order in which tasks were performed. Each gesture carried meaning, and Jake felt privileged to witness this knowledge firsthand. While Jake focused on observing and learning, a few villagers approached cautiously. They watched from a distance, murmuring among themselves. Some were genuinely curious about the stranger who had risked his life, while others remained skeptical, wary of potential consequences. Jake noticed the tension but did not react. Instead, he smiled gently at Nayeli, signaling that he would follow her lead and respect her guidance. This quiet patience began to soften some of the wary villagers, though others continued to watch silently, unsure of what to make of him. Over the following days, Jake and Nayeli spent more time together, exploring the land and understanding each other better. Jake learned that Nayeli's community relied heavily on the natural resources around them. Water from the river was precious, and food was carefully gathered or hunted. Every action was deliberate, every step considered, and the connection between the people and the land was profound. Jake admired this knowledge, realizing that survival in the desert required not just courage but a deep respect for the environment. Nayeli, in turn, began to see Jake in a new light. He was not just a rescuer but someone who respected her culture and valued her independence. He listened patiently, learned from her gestures, and never overstepped boundaries. This earned her trust, though she remained aware of the villagers' mixed feelings. She could sense that some elders were slowly warming to him, while others still harbored caution. It was a delicate balance, and she knew that Jake's future in the village depended on patience, respect, and careful understanding. However, despite the growing friendship and mutual respect, tension simmered beneath the surface. Not all villagers were convinced of Jake's intentions. Stories and suspicions spread quietly, fueled by fear of outsiders and old prejudices. Some villagers worried that his presence might attract danger or interfere with their way of life. They reminded each other that the desert was harsh and unforgiving, and that people who did not belong could unintentionally cause problems. Jake, unaware of all the whispered conversations, focused on helping in small, meaningful ways, hoping that consistent actions would ease concerns over time. One evening, as the sky turned golden and the air cooled, Jake sat with Nayeli near the river. The water shimmered in the fading light, and the quiet murmur of the flowing stream created a peaceful background. Nayeli leaned back against a smooth rock, exhausted from the day's work, while Jake rested nearby. They communicated through gestures, expressions, and broken words, sharing stories of their experiences. Nayeli pointed to the river, then to herself, explaining as best she could what had happened the day she nearly drowned. Jake nodded, understanding the fear, struggle, and courage it had taken to survive. Their bond deepened as they shared these moments of understanding. Jake realized that saving a life had not only changed Nayeli's circumstances, but had also transformed his own perspective. He had always been solitary, relying on his instincts and skills to navigate the wilderness. Now, he felt a connection he had never known, a sense of responsibility, empathy, and mutual care. Nayeli, in turn, saw him not just as a stranger but as a trusted companion who had risked everything to help her. Yet, the reality of their situation could not be ignored. Not all villagers were as accepting as Nayeli's family. Jake noticed glances filled with caution, whispers that carried judgment, and subtle signs that some people were still wary of him. He knew that misunderstandings could escalate if not handled carefully. Every step he took, every word he spoke, needed to show respect and integrity. Nayeli guided him, helping him understand what was appropriate, teaching him small gestures and customs that eased tensions. Despite these challenges, there were moments of genuine connection. Children approached Jake with curiosity, eager to learn about his horse, his skills, and the stories he carried from the wilderness. Elders who were initially distant began to acknowledge his presence, nodding in cautious approval. These small gestures encouraged Jake, reinforcing his belief that patience, respect, and consistent kindness could slowly overcome suspicion. Nayeli's guidance was invaluable, helping him navigate the complex social dynamics of the village while remaining true to himself. As days turned into weeks, Jake and Nayeli continued to strengthen their bond, balancing friendship, trust, and cultural understanding. They explored the land together, gathering resources, observing wildlife, and sharing knowledge. Jake admired Nayeli's connection to her people and the land, learning lessons about resilience, community, and the importance of respecting traditions. Nayeli appreciated Jake's courage, honesty, and willingness to adapt to a world very different from his own. However, the whispers and rumors persisted. A few villagers remained skeptical, spreading doubts and speculations about Jake's presence. They worried that outsiders could disrupt their way of life, attract danger, or create conflicts. Jake sensed the tension but remained calm, understanding that trust could not be forced. It had to be earned over time. He continued his quiet, consistent efforts to demonstrate his intentions, helping when needed, respecting boundaries, and learning from Nayeli and her community. One afternoon, as Jake and Nayeli walked along a dusty path near the outskirts of the village, they noticed a small group of villagers watching them from a distance. Their expressions were guarded, their eyes filled with curiosity and caution. Nayeli slowed her pace, gesturing for Jake to be careful. He nodded, understanding that the balance between acceptance and suspicion was delicate. Every action mattered, every word could influence perception, and the stakes were higher than he had initially realized. Through these experiences, Jake came to understand a profound truth. Heroism was not only about saving a life in a dramatic moment, but also about navigating the complex web of relationships, trust, and cultural understanding that followed. Nayeli's survival had brought gratitude and connection, but it had also created challenges, misunderstandings, and responsibilities he had never anticipated. The simple act of saving her life had set in motion a chain of events that would test his patience, judgment, and empathy in ways he had never imagined. By the end of the third week, Jake and Nayeli had developed a deep, unspoken understanding. Their friendship was strong, built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and the knowledge that each could rely on the other. Yet, the village remained a mixture of acceptance and suspicion, a reminder that trust took time and effort to cultivate. Jake knew that he could not force understanding, only demonstrate through his actions that his intentions were honorable. Nayeli continued to guide him, helping him navigate the subtle complexities of her world, and together they found ways to bridge the gap between two very different lives. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows over the desert, Jake sat quietly beside Nayeli near the riverbank. The flowing water reflected the colors of the sky, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of wild herbs and desert flora. In that moment, he reflected on the journey so far, the rescue, the growing bond, the subtle tensions, and the lessons learned. He realized that courage alone was not enough. Understanding, empathy, and patience were equally important. Nayeli, sensing his thoughts, offered a quiet smile, acknowledging the shared journey and the challenges still to come. The desert night settled over them, filled with the soft sounds of wildlife and the distant rustle of trees. Jake understood that their story was far from over. The events of the past weeks had created connections, sparked curiosity, and revealed tensions that required careful navigation. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, he felt a profound sense of purpose and belonging. Nayeli had not only survived the river, but had also opened his eyes to a world of relationships, trust, and cultural depth that he had never known. In the quiet of the night, as the stars began to twinkle overhead, Jake knew that the coming days would bring new challenges. Misunderstandings, judgments, and the cautious eyes of the villagers could create obstacles, but he felt ready to face them. The bond with Nayeli had strengthened, their trust growing despite the complexities around them. He understood that heroism was not a single act, but an ongoing commitment to integrity, respect, and empathy. And as he sat there, listening to the gentle flow of the river and the quiet whispers of the desert, Jake realized that this journey, fraught with uncertainty, yet filled with connection, was shaping him in ways he had never imagined. Days passed peacefully at first, with Jake. Carter continuing his quiet efforts to help Nayeli and her community. He guided her to safe paths, assisted with chores, and shared his knowledge of the desert. However, not everyone in the village viewed his presence with acceptance. Among the elders and some younger men, unease had begun to grow. Jake's arrival, while heroic in intent, had disrupted the normal rhythm of life in the village. They whispered concerns that his intentions might not be entirely pure, that the presence of a stranger could bring trouble, or worse, that he might take advantage of Nayeli in some way. Jake remained unaware of most of these discussions. He focused on doing what he could to help, assuming that his actions would naturally demonstrate his good intentions. Nayeli, however, noticed the subtle glances and hushed voices. She understood the cultural context and the weight of tradition in her community. While she trusted Jake completely, she knew that others might not, and she felt a growing responsibility to protect him from misunderstandings. One afternoon, Jake accompanied Nayeli to the river to collect herbs and wash some clothing. The sun was high, and the heat reflected off the water in dazzling patterns. As they worked, a small group of villagers approached from the opposite bank. Among them was a man named Tavo, a local rancher who had once encountered Jake from a distance, but had never interacted with him directly. Tavo had heard about Jake saving Nayeli and was envious of the attention the young cowboy had received. In Tavo's eyes, Jake's presence threatened the social order and respect within the village. Tavo's demeanor was cautious yet sharp. He called out to Nayeli, questioning why she was spending so much time with the stranger. His tone was not overtly hostile, but there was a hint of accusation. Nayeli explained through gestures and simple words that Jake had saved her life and that she trusted him. But Tavo was unconvinced. He began to spread subtle rumors among other villagers, suggesting that Jake might have hidden motives or that his presence could lead to problems. As word spread, tensions began to rise. Some villagers were curious and supportive, acknowledging the bravery and kindness Jake had shown, but others grew wary. The mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and jealousy created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Jake, still unaware of the full extent of the rumors, noticed the sudden changes in how some people interacted with him. Children who had previously approached with curiosity now hesitated. Elders who had nodded in cautious approval now kept their distance. He sensed that the delicate balance of trust and suspicion was shifting. Nayeli became increasingly concerned. She knew that Jake had acted selflessly, risking his life to save her, but she also understood that cultural misunderstandings could escalate quickly. In her community, outsiders were often seen as unpredictable, and a single misunderstanding could spiral into serious conflict. She tried to explain to Jake, through gestures and words, that he needed to be extra cautious and patient, that even small actions could be misinterpreted. Jake listened intently, recognizing the importance of navigating this new social landscape carefully. The situation escalated one evening when a meeting of elders was held near the center of the village. They discussed Jake's presence in hushed tones, debating whether he should continue to stay near Nayeli and her family. Some argued that his intentions were honorable, pointing to his consistent actions and his evident care for Nayeli. Others, however, emphasized caution, warning that outsiders could disrupt their way of life or bring unforeseen consequences. The discussion was intense, and Nayeli was torn between defending Jake and respecting the wisdom of her elders. Jake sensed the tension, but did not yet fully understand its source. He continued his routine quietly, helping where he could, observing traditions and maintaining respect for the villagers. However, small incidents began to fuel suspicion further. A misinterpreted gesture, a glance, or even a moment of conversation with Nayeli could be perceived as inappropriate by those watching from a distance. The situation required delicate handling, and Jake began to realize that heroism in the desert was about more than courage. It was also about diplomacy, patience, and cultural sensitivity. One morning, Jake decided to ride along the edge of the village to check water sources and gather firewood. While he was gone, Tavo used the opportunity to speak to Nayeli's family in private, planting seeds of doubt about Jake's intentions. He emphasized the potential risks of trusting an outsider, painting scenarios of betrayal, exploitation, or unwanted interference. By the time Jake returned, a quiet tension had spread through the village. Nayeli greeted him warmly, but her family seemed more reserved, their expressions filled with concern. Jake realized that he needed to address the growing mistrust. He arranged a meeting with Nayeli, her family, and a few of the elders who were willing to listen. Using gestures, simple words, and demonstrations of his consistent actions, he explained that his only intention had been to save a life and offer help when needed. He emphasized that he respected their customs, boundaries, and way of life, and that he had no desire to interfere with their community. Nayeli translated where possible, helping to clarify his words and intentions. Despite his efforts, tension did not immediately dissipate. The elders appreciated his honesty but remained cautious, wary of potential consequences. Tavo and a few others continued to watch from a distance, their skepticism persistent. Jake understood that trust could not be rushed. It had to be earned over time, through consistent action, respect, and patience. He resolved to continue showing integrity in every gesture, every interaction, and every decision. As the days went on, small incidents continued to test the fragile trust. One afternoon, a child wandered too close to the river while playing. Jake noticed immediately and rushed to ensure the child's safety, demonstrating his vigilance and concern for the community. Nayeli and her family watched, recognizing his sincerity and the genuine care he exhibited. Slowly, some villagers began to soften, seeing that his actions were not self-serving but rooted in respect and responsibility. Despite these positive developments, underlying tension persisted. Jake could feel the weight of suspicion, the delicate balance between gratitude and mistrust. He understood that every interaction mattered, that even a minor misunderstanding could have serious repercussions. He relied heavily on Nayeli's guidance, learning the nuances of behavior, gestures, and communication that were appropriate in her community. Together, they navigated the complex social dynamics, finding ways to demonstrate trustworthiness without overstepping boundaries. One evening, as the desert sky blazed with the colors of sunset, Jake reflected on the challenges he faced. The simple act of saving Naeli from the river had triggered a chain of events he had never anticipated. What began as a heroic moment had evolved into a complex web of relationships, trust, and cultural understanding. He realized that true heroism extended beyond the immediate act. It involved patience, empathy, and a willingness to navigate the unpredictable consequences of one's actions. Naeli, sitting beside him, sensed his thoughts. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm, conveying through touch and presence that she understood the challenges he faced. Her trust in him remained unwavering, even as the village continued to debate, question, and observe. Their bond had grown stronger through shared experiences, mutual respect, and the knowledge that they could rely on each other in moments of uncertainty and danger. Over time, Jake began to notice subtle signs of acceptance. Children approached him with curiosity rather than hesitation, eager to learn about his horse, his skills, and the stories he carried from the wilderness. Some elders who had been cautious began to acknowledge his presence with quiet nods and brief conversations. Naeli's family gradually allowed him to assist with chores and guidance, seeing that his intentions were consistent and honorable. Each small gesture reinforced the trust slowly being built, though full acceptance remained elusive. Despite these positive signs, the presence of jealousy and suspicion could not be ignored. Tavo and a few other villagers continued to question Jake's motives, their actions subtle but persistent. They monitored his movements, whispered among themselves, and speculated about the consequences of his continued presence. Jake recognized that while some trust had been earned, the potential for conflict remained. He understood that patience, humility, and consistency were his best tools in navigating this delicate situation. One night, as the stars twinkled over the desert and the river murmured softly nearby, Jake and Naeli sat quietly, reflecting on the events of the past weeks. They had formed a deep bond, grounded in shared experience, mutual respect and trust, yet the challenges surrounding them were undeniable. Jake realized that his heroism had extended far beyond saving a life. It had created new responsibilities, relationships, and expectations that required careful attention. Naeli understood the complexity as well, aware that her trust alone could not fully shield him from misunderstanding or conflict within the village. As they prepared for the coming days, both Jake and Naeli knew that careful navigation would be essential. The bonds they had formed were strong, yet fragile, and the path ahead required vigilance, respect, and empathy. Jake had learned that true courage involved not just physical action, but emotional intelligence, patience, and the ability to understand perspectives different from one's own. Naeli, likewise, had learned that trust could be extended carefully, balancing gratitude with awareness, and that the world beyond her immediate experience could offer both risk and reward. And so, as the desert night wrapped around them, Jake and Naeli sat together, united by experience, trust, and the quiet knowledge that the challenges they faced were part of a larger journey. The events of the river, the village, and the unfolding tension had changed both of their lives, creating a complex web of relationships, responsibilities, and lessons that would shape their future. The quiet desert seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see how the next chapter of their story would unfold, a story of courage, trust, and the unforeseen consequences of a single heroic act. The days following the tension in the village passed with a careful balance of caution and trust. Jake Carter had learned that his actions, while honorable, carried consequences he had not anticipated. The whispers, the wary glances, and the small misunderstandings were not born of malice, but of concern and caution. In this community, where traditions were sacred and outsiders rare, every action mattered. Jake understood now that heroism was more than courage. It required patience, respect, and empathy. Naeli guided him carefully through these delicate social waters. She explained which gestures were acceptable, how to communicate respectfully, and when it was best to remain silent. Through her guidance, Jake began to understand the subtleties of her world, the importance of rituals, and the significance of each interaction. Their bond, forged in the river and strengthened through shared experience, became a bridge between two very different ways of life. Slowly, the village began to see Jake not as a threat, but as someone who genuinely cared. Small acts, consistent and humble, began to speak louder than words. He helped repair fences, guided villagers to water sources, and shared his knowledge of the land. He treated everyone with respect, especially the elders, and never overstepped the boundaries of tradition. Naeli's family, once cautious, gradually accepted him fully, recognizing that his presence brought no harm and that his intentions were sincere. Even Tavo, who had once been skeptical and jealous, began to see Jake in a different light. One afternoon, while Jake was helping the community build a small corral for livestock, Tavo observed from a distance. He noticed Jake patiently guiding a young boy and handling the animals, correcting mistakes gently, and encouraging him without criticism. This simple display of care and skill slowly softened Tavo's skepticism. Though not fully trusting yet, Tavo began to acknowledge that Jake was indeed honorable. Naeli and Jake spent increasing amounts of time together, not just in practical matters but in conversation, gestures, and quiet moments. They shared stories of their lives, of challenges faced and lessons learned. Jake spoke of his years traveling alone, the harsh lessons of the desert, and the freedom and loneliness of solitude. Naeli shared the history of her people, the importance of family and community, and the values passed down from her elders. Each story, each gesture, and each shared laugh strengthened their bond and deepened their understanding of one another. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the villagers gathered near the river for a small ceremony. It was a moment of gratitude and reflection, honoring both the land and the community's resilience. Jake watched quietly from a respectful distance as Naeli and her family participated in the ritual. Though he could not fully understand every word or gesture, he sensed the significance and importance of the moment. Naeli reached out and gently guided him closer, signaling that he was welcome to observe and share in the respect being offered. Through these experiences, Jake realized that his journey had transformed him. He had come as a lone cowboy, focused on survival and solitude, yet he had discovered the profound value of connection, trust, and empathy. Saving Naeli had been an act of courage, but the lessons that followed, about patience, understanding, and respect, were even more meaningful. He understood now that the true impact of heroism was measured not only in immediate action, but in the ripple effects it created in the lives of others. For Naeli, the experience had been equally transformative. She had faced danger and uncertainty in the river and witnessed the bravery and selflessness of Jake. She had navigated the complexities of her community's response, balancing gratitude with caution. Through it all, she had learned that trust could be extended thoughtfully, and that courage was not only physical but emotional, requiring openness and understanding. She appreciated Jake not just for saving her life, but for the respect and integrity he demonstrated afterward. In the weeks that followed, Jake became a quiet, trusted presence in the village. He did not seek recognition or reward. His satisfaction came from knowing that he had helped, respected, and learned. The villagers gradually accepted him, some with warmth and others with cautious respect. The community had witnessed his integrity, his patience, and his humility, and these qualities gradually overcame the initial suspicions and misunderstandings. One morning, Naeli led Jake to a high hill overlooking the village and the river below. From this vantage point, the desert stretched endlessly, golden and serene. She gestured toward the village, then toward Jake, expressing gratitude and acknowledgement for his courage and care. Jake nodded, understanding the silent communication. They shared a quiet moment of reflection, recognizing the journey they had traveled together, from the panic and danger of the river to the complexities of trust, respect, and community acceptance. As they returned to the village, Jake noticed children running toward them, eager to learn, play, and engage. Elders smiled quietly from a distance, a subtle acknowledgement of their acceptance. Even Tavo, once skeptical, offered a nod of respect. The ripple effects of a single act of bravery had extended far beyond the immediate rescue. What had begun as a life-saving act had grown into a story of connection, empathy, and mutual respect that touched the lives of many. In the evenings, Jake and Nayeli would often sit together by the river, the water glimmering under the moonlight. They spoke quietly, sometimes through words, other times through gestures and shared glances. The bond between them had matured into one of deep trust and understanding. Jake had learned to appreciate the wisdom of Nayeli's people, and Nayeli had come to recognize the strength, patience, and integrity in Jake. Together, they reflected on the journey and the lessons they had learned. That courage alone was not enough, that actions carried consequences, and that trust, once earned, could build bridges between worlds. As the desert nights grew cooler, Jake prepared for the possibility of moving on. He had responsibilities in the wilderness, and life as a lone cowboy awaited him. Yet he felt a deep connection to this village and to Nayeli. He realized that their story was not just about the past few weeks, but about the lasting impact of kindness, courage, and empathy. The experiences shared, the lessons learned, and the trust earned had become part of him, shaping his understanding of the world and his place in it. Before leaving, Jake helped organize a small gathering for the village, a day of gratitude, reflection, and celebration of survival and community. He worked quietly, assisting wherever needed, ensuring that everything honored the traditions and customs of Nayeli's people. The villagers came together, sharing stories, food, and laughter. They recognized not only Jake's courage, but also the respect and humility he had shown throughout his time among them. It was a moment of unity, a celebration of the bonds formed through understanding, patience, and shared experience. Nayeli stood beside Jake, her eyes shining with gratitude and warmth. She placed her hand gently on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey and the impact of his presence. Jake smiled, recognizing the unspoken connection that had grown between them. They both understood that heroism extended far beyond the riverbank. It lived in everyday actions, in respect for others, and in the courage to navigate complex relationships with honesty and integrity. As the sun set for the final time during Jake's stay, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, he reflected on the journey he had taken. He had come as a stranger, a lone cowboy navigating the desert, and had saved a life in an act of courage and instinct. But the true story had unfolded afterward, in the quiet moments of learning, understanding, and building trust. He had faced misunderstandings, navigated cultural boundaries, and witnessed the power of patience and empathy. In the process, he had grown, not just as a cowboy, but as a human being capable of connection, understanding, and respect. Nayeli, too, had grown. She had faced danger, uncertainty, and the complexities of community judgment. She had trusted Jake, guided him, and learned from his integrity. Their shared experiences had deepened her understanding of courage, compassion, and the importance of balancing trust with awareness. She had discovered that kindness and bravery could bridge differences and create connections that transcended culture, tradition, and expectation. Finally, as Jake prepared to leave the village and continue his journey through the desert, Nayeli's family gathered to bid him farewell. Children waved, elders nodded, and even those who had been skeptical smiled quietly, acknowledging his integrity. Nayeli stood beside him, her eyes filled with warmth, gratitude, and a hint of sadness. They did not need words to express what had passed between them: the river, the rescue, the challenges, the trust, and the lessons learned. Their bond was unspoken but powerful, a testament to the transformative power of courage, empathy, and respect. Jake mounted his horse and looked back one last time. The village, the river, and the desert stretched before him, symbols of a journey that had begun with a single heroic act and had grown into something far greater. He carried with him the lessons learned, the bonds formed, and the understanding that heroism is not just in the act itself, but in the patience, respect, and integrity that follow. Naomi watched until he disappeared into the horizon, knowing that their lives had been forever changed by courage, trust, and the unforeseen consequences of a single moment. And so, the lone cowboy rode into the vast desert, forever carrying the story of the young Apache woman he had saved, a story of bravery, connection, and the enduring power of empathy. Though their paths diverged, the lessons and trust they had built would remain, shaping their futures, guiding their choices, and reminding them that a single act of courage can ripple through lives in ways beyond imagination. The desert, silent and eternal, witnessed their journey, holding in its vast expanse the memory of bravery, respect, and the enduring bonds of human connection.